So today I'm going to read from The New God Image by Dr. Edward Edinger, a study of Jungian key letters, a study of Jung's key letters concerning the evolution of the Western God image. Today I'm going to read from his two letters by the Reverend David Cox. Now these are very important letters, I believe. They have been hidden by the Jungian community, in my belief, for several decades. I believe that's because they were trying to protect the fledgling profession of psychotherapy from attacks by theologians. But anyway, it's part of the evolution of human consciousness, so it's something that I think we need. Now, this is a behind-the-scenes session, so I make no warranties as to the perfection of this reading or to anything else. I will edit this video later on in order to do a more perfect version of the letters to the Reverend David Cox. But before I begin the actual letters, I want to read this prefatory material from Dr. Edinger. So in Chapter 9, page 109, in Chapter 9, page 109 of The New God Image, Dr. Edinger says, "The Cox letters were written September 25, 1957, and November 12, 1957. In the first letter to David Cox, Jung gives a description of the historical evolution of the God image from two different standpoints. The first standpoint is what he calls euhemerism. The first standpoint is what he calls the euhemeristic standpoint, which refers to the ancient figure Euhemerus, who lived about 300 years BC. He developed a personalistic, rational interpretation of mythology. His idea was that mythology was, of course, all the bunk, that it does not refer to anything transcendent. There are no such things as gods. Rather, mythology derives from certain prominent human beings who made an impression on their contemporaries. These larger-than-life human heroes then got translated into myth. Such a rational, personalistic attitude is called euhemerism today. Jung says it is one way of looking at the evolution of the God image. I'm just taking abbreviated portions of this because I want to get into the letter itself, but I'm going to carry on a little bit later in what Dr. Edinger said. The metaphysical world is understood as the projection of human psychology, so that the whole transpersonal dimension that used to be experienced as part of the realm of the gods is explained away euhemeristically. So that the whole transpersonal dimension that used to be experienced as part of the realm of the gods is explained away euhemeristically. It is It is a common modern viewpoint. According to this description, then, the ego outgrows the gods. The result is that it left a dissociated state because it is cut off from the transpersonal dimension out of which it comes. Since a dissociated state is not satisfactory, Jung goes on to speak of the other way of looking at it, from the standpoint of the archetype. From that standpoint, the evolution of the God image is thought of as a dynamic process of development in the archetype itself. It does not just reflect the development of human consciousness, but is an image of its own inner evolution. Sorry, in these behind-the-scenes, hi Miles. In these behind-the-scenes videos, your live streams, you're going to get all my scratching of my nose. I'll just show you, though, since you're here, something funny. Later in this discussion that Dr. Edinger was making, the previous owner of this book, I bought it secondhand so I could mark it up, and the previous owner of this book, around one portion of this, which I'm going to read later, said here, "Not that I want to put pressure on you." So, not that I want to put pressure. Pressure is written here backward, down and backwards on you. So, let's see if I can show that. Okay, there it is. All right. So, So I'll just read this portion since it's interesting. So this is a later portion in Dr. Edinger's comment. He says, "Society is no more than the sum total of all the individuals that make it up. It is not anything else. Therefore, the collective psyche of the human race is the sum total of all the individual psyches. It is a certain number of individual psyches if a certain number of individual psyches have had the experience whereby the God image, by reaching consciousness, has achieved the transformation, then those few individuals will function something like yeast in the dough. The interesting question, of course, is how many will it take? The Old Testament went into this question. You remember Abraham disputed with Yahweh about how many righteous men there would have to be in a city before he would decline to destroy it. He, Abraham, got him down to 10. I think we have to take that symbolically rather than literally. There is no way of knowing, I think, each individual. There is no way of knowing, I think. I think each individual ought to live his life out of the hypothesis that maybe one would do." This was Jung's comment. And then he says, Jung makes clear that the task is a dangerous one. Quote, "In order to accomplish this task, this is the task of the union of the opposites, the incarnation task, man is inspired by the Holy Ghost in such a way that he is apt to identify him with his own mind. He even runs the grave risk of believing he has a messianic mission and forces tyrannous doctrines upon his fellow beings. He would do better to disidentify his mind from the small voice within. from dreams and fantasies through which the divine spirit manifests itself. One should listen to the inner voice attentively, intelligently, and critically. Probate spiritus, test the spirits, because the voice one hears is the influxus divinus, consisting, as the Acts of John aptly state, of the right and left streams, i.e., of opposites. They have to be clearly separated so that their positive and negative aspects become visible. Only thus can we take a middle position and discover a middle way. That is the task left to man, and that is the reason why man is so important to God that he decided to come. And that is the reason why man is so important to God that he decided to become a man himself. Unquote. Now I'm going to leave this part of Dr. Edinger's talk and go directly into the David Cox letters now, because I read this last summer while I was recovering from total knee replacement. I've had a couple of joints replaced in the last year. And so while I was laid up in the middle of the night, I was reading this book, and I came across these letters and said, wow, this is what I really wanted. So anyway, this is I guess I should also tell you the secret here. So the secret is, part of the secret, and these letters are found in Collected Works, Volume 18, paragraphs 1648 to 1690. So if you're a member of our Dropbox, which you can do by sending me email to skip.conover@gmail.com, you can actually see these letters yourself. But in any case, there's a footnote here that I suppose I should read to you. This is footnote number 1. Extracts from H.L. Philip, Jung and the Problem of Evil, London, 1958, pages 239 to 250. The book consists of correspondence between the author, Philip, and Jung in the form of questions and answers in English, and an extended critical attack of 175 pages on Jung's writings on religion, with particular reference to Answer to Job. So this is one of these theologians who was often attacking Jung during his lifetime. But it says, it concludes with Jung's answers to questions sent by another correspondent, the Reverend David Cox, author of Jung and St. Paul, 1959. Jung's answers to Cox's letters are reproduced here by permission of the Princeton University Press. Well, I actually have no permission from Princeton University Press, but I consider this a fair use, so I'm going to go on. Clive asked me, does Jung ever speak on infinity or the concept of infinity in relation to God? Well, he certainly does, but he doesn't really talk about or want to talk about the metaphysical God. This was his way of trying to avoid the necessity of having a battle with the theologians, because he always emphasized that he wasn't talking about the theologians' metaphysical God. He was talking about the psychological God that he could prove in the unconscious. the God image. And so he was talking about the God image from a psychological point of view. Now, it may be fair enough to say, well, everything in psychology is metaphysical, and I think that that's a fair enough statement. I mean, I think it's metaphysical because you can't put a finger on it. It's out there in hyperspace, but and it certainly can be tested empirically, but it can only be tested empirically using Dr. Jung's method. If you turn Carl Sagan or Neil deGrasse Tyson loose on it, they're hopeless because they say, "Oh, there's no God. Because we can't find God." Well, but that's the way some of their concepts are too. You just listen to them. I actually wrote an article about this at one point. But anyway, Dr. Jung always talked about the metaphysical God as being everything already and omniscient. And he said, but he really, as a psychologist, doesn't know anything about that. And Dr. Edinger said the same. And so they only know about the God image, which they can identify in the deep unconscious, in depth psychology. And so that's what I'm talking about. But mind you, I don't mind if I step on a few theologians' toes, because they've certainly stepped on my toes in my lifetime. And if you don't know what I mean, then go put a query into the YouTube channel and see if you can't find the video I did on my encounter with Mephistopheles. I did a YouTube video on that. But that was a psychogenic experience of mine. And it was thanks to fundamentalist theologians. So I think that's why I have had great interest in what Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger were saying. So if you want to know where I'm coming from, that's probably where I'm coming from. All right, so here we're going to read the letter to Dr. David Cox, 25 September 1957. The crux of this question is, within your own personality, Christ can be an external reality, historical and metaphysical, or an archetypal image or idea in the collective unconscious, pointing to an unknown background. I would understand the former mainly as a projection, but not the latter. So what he's saying here is that Christ as an external reality, as a historical and metaphysical figure, is a projection. But if you understand Christ as a symbol of the self, which is the deepest archetype within the unconscious, then Christ is an archetypal image or idea in the collective unconscious, pointing to an unknown background. So anyway, carrying on with the letter now. I would understand the former mainly as a projection, but not the latter, because it is immediately evident. It is not projected upon anything, therefore there is no projection. Only faith in Christ is different from faith in anyone else, since in this case, Christ being immediately evident, the word faith, including or alluding to the possibility of doubt, seems too feeble a word to characterize the powerful presence from which there is no escape. A general can say to his soldiers, "You must have faith in me," because one might doubt him, but you cannot say to a man lying wounded in the battlefield, You ought to believe that this is a real battle, or be sure you are, or, quote, be sure you are up against the enemy, unquote. It is just too obvious. Even the historical Jesus began to speak of faith because he saw that his disciples had no immediate evidence. Instead, they had to believe, while he himself, being identical with God, had no need to have faith in God. As one habitually identifies the psyche with what one knows of it, it is assumed that one can call certain supposed or believed metaphysical entities non-psychic. Being a responsible scientist, I am unable to pass such a judgment, for all I know of regular religious phenomena seems to indicate that they are psychic events. Moreover, I do not know the full reach of the psyche because there is the limitless extent of the unconscious. Christ is definitely an archetypal image. I don't add only. And that is all I actually know of him. I'll read that sentence again. Christ is definitely an archetypal image. I don't add only. And that is all I actually know of him. As such, he belongs to the collective foundations of the psyche. I identify him, therefore, with what I call the self. The self rules the whole of the psyche. I think our opinions do not differ essentially. You seem to have trouble only with the theological and self-inflicted devaluation of the psyche, which you apparently believe to be ultimately definable. If my identification of Christ with the archetype of the self is valid, he is or ought to be a complexio oppositorum. Historically, this is not so. Therefore, I was profoundly surprised by your statement that Christ contains the opposites. Between my contention and historical Christianity, there stretches that deep abyss of Christian dualism, Christ and the devil, good and evil, God and creation. Beyond good and evil simply means we pass no moral judgment. But in fact, nothing is changed. The same is true when we state that whatever God is or does is good, since God does everything, even man created by him is his instrument. Everything is good, and the term good has lost its meaning. Good is a relative term. There is no good without bad. I'm afraid that even revealed truth has to evolve. Everything living changes. We should not be satisfied with unchangeable traditions. The great battle that began with the dawn of consciousness has not reached its climax with any particular interpretation, apostolic, Catholic, Protestant, or otherwise. Even the highly conservative Catholic Church has overstepped its ancient rule of apostolic authenticity with the Assumption Beatae Virginis, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. And this is a reference to Pope Pius XII's papal bull in 1950, in which he acknowledged that the Virgin Mary went into heaven and sitteth in the heavenly chamber with the Trinity. According to what I hear from Catholic theologians, the next step would be the this word is split up on the page and it's a new word to me. The next step would be the Co-Redemptrix. The next step would be the Co-Redemptrix. This obvious recognition of the female element is very important. This obvious recognition of the female element is a very important step forward. It means psychologically the recognition of the unconscious, since the representative of the collective unconscious is the anima, the archetype of all divine mothers, at least in the masculine psyche. The equivalent on the Protestant side would be a confrontation with the unconscious as the counterpart or consort of the masculine logos. The hitherto valid symbol of the supreme spiritual structure was Trinity plus Satan, the so-called 3+1 structure, corresponding to 3 conscious functions versus the 1 unconscious, so-called inferior function, or 1 plus 3 if the conscious side is understood as 1 versus the conscious side is 1 versus the so-called inferior orthonic triad, mythologically characterized as 3 mother figures. There's a footnote here. I think we need to understand what this footnote is. Oh, it's going to get too complicated because the footnote is to the phenomenology of the spirit in fairy tales and the spirit Mercurius, which is a long essay of Dr. Jung's. So I'm going to set that aside for the time being. So, mythologically characterized as 3 mother figures. I suppose that the negative evaluation of the unconscious has something to do with the fact that it has hitherto been represented by Satan, while in reality it is the female aspect of man's psyche, and thus not wholly evil in spite of the old saying, Vir a Deo creatus mulier a simia Dei. Okay, just a minute. I think we have to get a definition of that, so I'm going to take a moment to get my Latin translation going here. So it is Vir a Deo creatus mulier a simia Dei. Oh my God. Okay, so the literal meaning of this is God created man, a woman from the monkey. That's the literal translation of this. So I'm going to give it to you. This is so we see why Dr. Jung is so popular with the theologians, because he's calling them out on these ideas. But anyway, okay, so that's how my machine translation from the Latin gives it to us. So Matthew Hill says, oh, okay, so that's the word. I'm sorry, Matthew, you're right. It's Co-Redemptrix. And so I need to go back and read from that point, because I'm trying to read this to make a later video of this letter, and I did not understand the word. So Matthew says Co-Redemptrix. Now this is an advantage of doing this live. Co-Redemptrix is a title used by some Roman Catholics for the Blessed Virgin Mary, as well as a Catholic theological concept referring to Mary's role in the redemption of all peoples. It has always been controversial and has never formed part of the dogma of the church. Okay, I can't say as far as that is concerned, Matthew, but I do know that Dr. Jung was very impressed by the assumption of the Virgin Mary into heaven, which was the Papal Bull of 1950. I don't know whether that counts as a dogma or whatever, but it's mentioned in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job, where Dr. Jung says that he felt that was the most important religious statement since the Reformation, or the most important religious development since the Reformation. But because you correctly told me what this word is, and it had been split up on my page, I'm going to go back and reread from there. So here it goes. According to what I hear from Catholic theologians, the next step would be the Co-Redemptrix. This obvious recognition of the female element is a very important step forward. It means psychologically the recognition of the unconscious, since the representative of the collective unconscious is the anima, the archetype of all divine mothers, at least in the masculine psyche. The equivalent on the Protestant side would be a confrontation with the unconscious as the counterpart or consort of the masculine logos. The hitherto valid symbol of the supreme spiritual structure was Trinity plus Satan, the so-called 3+1 structure, corresponding to 3 conscious functions versus the 1 unconscious so-called inferior function, or 1 plus 3 if the conscious side is understood as 1 versus the so-called inferior orthonic triad, mythologically characterized as 3 mother figures. I suppose that the negative evaluation of the unconscious has something to do with the fact that it has been hitherto represented by Satan, while in reality it is the female aspect of man's psyche, and thus not wholly evil, in spite of the old saying, which is the saying I put up there, the Latin saying, it comes across better in Latin, don't you think? In spite of the old saying, vir a Deo creatus, mulier a simia Dei. It seems to me of paramount importance that Protestantism should integrate psychological experience, as, for example, Jacob Boehme did. It says, as, for instance, Jacob Boehme did. With him, God does not only contain love, but, on the other side, and in the same measure, the fire of wrath in which Lucifer himself dwells. Christ is a revelation of his love, but he can manifest his wrath in an Old Testament way. Just as well, i.e., in the form of evil. Inasmuch as out of evil good may come, and out of good evil, we do not know whether creation is ultimately good or a regrettable mistake and God's suffering. It is an I don't know why my nose is itching so much today. It is an ineffable mystery. At any rate, we are not doing justice either to nature in general or to our own human nature when we deny the immensity of evil and suffering and turn our eyes from the cruel aspect of creation. Evil should be recognized, and one should not attribute the existence of evil to man. And one should not and one should not attribute the existence of evil to man's sinfulness. Yahweh is not offended by being feared. Okay, so let's see. Miles says binary switch 1 or 0 is the basis of our computers and seems fundamental to life. And yes, and as I've been reading recently, I find that the ancients were writing about this stuff actually around the time of the beginning of the Old Testament. The ancient Egyptians were writing about it. Matthew says, I just copy and pasted from Google. I usually just Google any new words. Yeah, well, when you got Co-Redemptrix. Anyway, thank you for doing that, because that one was mystical to me, because I had co-hyphen on one page or one line and Redemptrix on the other, and I was trying to understand whether this was core. I was very confused. Anyway, reading on. It is quite understandable why it was an the word is eugelon. Okay, this is confusing me too. I'm going to see if it's in the Latin here. I think it might be in eugelon. Translates from Latin into English as eugelon, same word. Okay, but Jung has another way of saying it, which is evangel, good tidings. Okay, so I'm going to read it that way. It is quite understandable why it was an It is quite understandable why it was an It is quite understandable why it was an evangel, good tidings, to learn of the Bonitas Dei and of his Son. It was known to the ancients that self-knowledge was a prerequisite for this, not only in the Greco-Roman world, but also in the Far East. It is to the individual attitude that the man Jesus owes his apotheosis. He became the symbol of the self under the aspect of the infinite goodness, which was certainly the symbol most needed in ancient civilization, as it is still needed today. It can be considered a fact that the dogmatic figure of Christ is the result of a condensation process from various sources. One of the main origins is the age-old god-man of Egypt, Osiris Horus and his 4 sons. I hope that sound isn't too bad that I'm getting here. It so happens that I live next to the sewage treatment plant, and sometimes it's I don't know why they put a gated community next to a sewage treatment plant, but I guess it's because we're right next to the Severn River. Anyway, moving on. That's a little sidelight you probably didn't need. It can be considered a fact that the dogmatic figure of Christ is the result of a condensation process from various sources. One of the main origins is the age-old god-man of Egypt, Osiris Horus and his 4 sons. It was a remodeling of the unconscious archetype hitherto projected upon a divine non-human being. By embodying itself in a historical man, it came nearer to consciousness, but in keeping with the mental capacity of the time, it remained as if suspended between God and man, between the need for good and the fear of evil. Any doubt about the absolute bonitas Dei, goodness of God, would have led to an immediate regression to the former pagan state, i.e., to the amorality of the metaphysical principle. One of the key ideas in Dr. Jung's work is that if ever an advance in psychology drops back, regresses, then we regress to an earlier state. And so they say fundamentalism is an example of that. And so when our high-flown principles don't succeed, then people fall back on fundamentalism in order to, and tribalism, to defend their family, whatever. But it's a more primitive state, is what Dr. Jung said. So then he goes on. Since then, 2,000 years have passed. In this time, we have learned that good and evil are categories of our moral judgment, therefore relative to man. Thus, the way was opened for a new model of the self. Moral judgment is a necessity of the human mind. The Christ is the Christian model that expresses the self as the anthropos, is the corresponding Egypto-Judaic formula. Let me reread this because this is a complicated sentence. The Christ is the Christian model that expresses the self as the anthropos is the corresponding Egypto-Judaic formula. Moral qualification is withdrawn from the deity. The Catholic Church has almost succeeded in adding femininity to the masculine. The Catholic Church has almost succeeded in adding femininity to the masculine trinity. Protestantism is confronted with the psychological problem of the unconscious. Okay, so this is where Dr. Jung gets accused of being an early feminist. But mind you, I believe it's an answer to Job, he talks about the reasons for the assumption of the Virgin Mary, and that was caused by the fact that everybody in the Catholic Church was saying their Hail Marys, and they were looking to the Virgin Mary as a Co-Redemptrix or a Redemptrix, and so the Pope couldn't deny that, and there became a lot of pressure about it, and especially after 2 world wars. So this papal bull came along in 1950, just 5 years after World War II. And I do remember, for example, from the movie A Bridge Too Far, where the British troops are praying the rosary. And so the church just couldn't deny it any longer. So, reading on here. So the last sentence was, Protestantism is confronted with the psychological problem of the unconscious. It is, as far as I can see, a peculiar process extending over at least 4,000 years of mental evolution. It can be contemplated in a euhermistic way as a development of man's understanding of the supreme powers beyond his control. The process consists of the following stages. 1. Gods. 2. A supreme deity ruling the gods and demons. 3. God shares our human fate, is betrayed, killed or dies, and is resurrected again. There is a feminine counterpart dramatically involved in God's fate. 4. God becomes a man in the flesh and thus historical. He is identified with the abstract idea of the summum bonum and loses the feminine counterpart. The female deity is degraded to an ancillary position, the church. Consciousness begins to prevail against the unconscious. This is an enormously important step forward in the emancipation of consciousness and in the liberation of thought from its involvement in things. Thus the foundation of science is laid, but on the other hand, that of atheism and materialism. Both are inevitable consequences of the basic split between spirit and matter. In Christian philosophy, which proclaimed the redemption of the spirit from the body and its fetters. 5. The whole metaphysical world is understood as a psychic structure projected into the sphere of the unknown. So I think that what he means by that 5-step process is it's euhemerism. So I think he's talking about euhemerism with that 5-step process. The danger of this viewpoint is exaggerated skepticism and rationalism, since the original supreme powers are reduced to mere representations over which one assumes one has complete control. This leads to a complete negation of the supreme powers, scientific materialism. The other way of looking at it is from the standpoint of the archetype. The original chaos of multiple gods evolves into a sort of monarchy. The archetype of the self slowly asserts its central position as the archetype of order in chaos. One God rules supreme, but apart from man. It begins to show a tendency to relate itself to consciousness through a process of penetration. It begins to show a tendency to relate itself to consciousness through a process of penetration, the humanizing effect of a feminine intercession, expressed, for instance, by the Isis intrigue. In the Christian myth, the deity, the self, penetrates consciousness almost completely without any visible loss of power and prestige, but in time it becomes obvious that the incarnation has caused a loss among the supreme powers. The indispensable dark side has been left behind or stripped off, and the feminine aspect is missing. Thus, a further act of incarnation becomes necessary. Through atheism, through atheism, materialism, and agnosticism, the powerful yet one-sided aspect of the summum bonum is weakened so that it cannot keep out of the dark side and incidentally the feminine factor anymore. Antichrist and devil gain the ascendancy. God asserts his power through the revelation of his darkness and destructiveness. Man is merely instrumental in carrying out the divine plan. Obviously, he does not want his destruction, but is forced to it by his own inventions. He is entirely unfree in his actions because he does not yet understand that he is a mere instrument of the destructive superior will. From this paradox, he could learn that the word is nolens volens, so let's look this one up too. So it comes across as nolens volens, and the translation is, and refuse to willingly. So we'll have to. Okay. Hello, Marie. How are you? Nice to see you. So, and refuse to willingly. Okay, nolens volens. Where was I? Oh my God. Yeah, my problem is I underlined this, and my previous owner of this book underlined it, and so some of it is hard to read. Okay. From this paradox, he could learn that, nolens volens, he serves a supreme power. So, I don't quite understand what Dr. Jung is saying with nolens volens there, but anyway. And that supreme powers exist in spite of his denial. As God lives in everybody in the form of the scintilla of the self, man could see his demonic, i.e. ambivalent, nature in himself, and thus he could understand how he is penetrated by God and how God incarnates in man. Okay, so one key point here is that Dr. Jung believes that we're being lived by the self, and our thoughts don't come from our ego. They come from a deeper place that we cannot identify. And whether you call that God or the unconscious or whatever, it's coming in that direction, outward, toward our consciousness. Through his further incarnation, God becomes a fearful task for man, who must now find ways and means to unite the divine opposites in himself. He is summoned and can no longer leave his sorrows to somebody else, not even to Christ, because it was Christ that has left him the almost impossible task of the because it was Christ that has left him the almost possible because it was Christ that has left him the almost impossible task of his cross. Christ has shown how everybody, will be crucified upon his destiny, i.e., upon his self as he was, i.e., upon his self as he was. He did not carry his cross and suffer crucifixion so that we could escape. The bill of the Christian era is presented to us. We are living in a world rent in two from top to bottom. We are confronted with the H-bomb. We are confronted with the H-bomb, and we have to face our own shadows. Obviously, God does not want us to remain little children looking out for a parent who will do their job for them. We are cornered by the supreme power of the incarnating will. God really wants to become man, even if he rends him asunder. This is so no matter what we say. One cannot talk the H-bomb or communism out of the world. We are in the soup that is going to be cooked for us, whether we claim to have invented it or not. Christ said to his disciples, "Ye are gods." This word becomes painfully true. If God incarnates in the empirical man, man is confronted with the divine problem. Being and remaining man, he has to find an answer. It is the question of the opposites, raised at the moment when God was declared to be good only. Where then is the dark side? Christ is the model for the human answers, and his symbol is the cross, the union of the opposites. This will be the fate of man, and this he must understand if he is to survive at all. We are threatened with universal genocide if we cannot work out the way of salvation by a symbolic death. By a symbolic death, Dr. Jung is referring to the transformation of the God image and the fact that the new God image has to include both the good and the evil. In order to accomplish his task, man is inspired by the Holy Ghost in such a way that he is apt to identify him with his own mind. He even runs the grave risk of believing he has a messianic mission and forces tyrannous doctrines upon his fellow beings. He would do better to disidentify his mind from the small voice within, from dreams and fantasies through which the divine spirit manifests itself. One should listen to the inner voice attentively, intelligently, and critically. Probate spiritists test the spirits, because the voice one hears is the influxus divinus, consisting, as the act of John aptly state, the right and left streams, i.e., the opposites. They have to be clearly separated so that their positive and negative aspects become visible. Only thus can we take up a middle position and discover a middle way. That is the task left to man, and that is the reason why man is so important to God, that he decided to become a man himself. I apologize for the length of this exposition. Please do not think I am stating a truth. Okay, before I go on to this next two paragraphs are the two paragraphs that kind of knocked my socks off when I read it the first time. And so these two paragraphs are the reason why I'm reading this letter now. I must apologize for the length of this exposition. Please do not think that I am stating a truth. I am merely trying to present a hypothesis which might explain the bewildering conclusions resulting from the clash of traditional symbols and psychological experiences. I thought it best to put my cards on the table so that you get a clear picture of my ideas. Although all this sounds as if it were some sort of theological speculation, it is in reality modern man's perplexity expressed in symbolic terms. It is the problem I so often had to deal with in treating the neuroses of intelligent patients. It can be expressed in a more scientific, psychological language. For instance, instead of using the term God, you say unconscious. Instead of Christ, self. Instead of incarnation, integration of the unconscious. Instead of salvation or redemption, individuation. Instead of crucifixion or sacrifice, on the cross, realization of the four functions or of wholeness. I think it is no disadvantage to religious tradition if we can see how far it coincides with psychological experience. On the contrary, it seems to me a most welcome aid in understanding religious traditions. Is everybody still with me? Oh, yes. Okay. Carl Jung, Psychology and Alchemy says, that reminds me of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where man becomes the Ubermensch because God is dead and we killed him. That's right. But of course, Nietzsche proclaimed in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that God is dead. And what Dr. Jung is saying is that the Holy Spirit is living within us. And it's called the self. It's the psychological archetype of the self. And it is directing our lives. And so it's sort of like the mirror opposite of what Nietzsche's position was. So I read the big paragraph, the one with the combinations. Now, how long have we got here? Okay. So a myth remains a myth, even if certain people believe it to be the literal revelation of an eternal truth. But it becomes moribund if the living truth it contains ceases to be an object of belief. It is therefore necessary to renew its life from time to time through a new interpretation. This means, excuse me, my stomach is getting in my way. This means readapting it to the changing spirit of the times. What the Church calls prefigurations refers to the original state of the myth, while the Christian doctrine represents a new interpretation and readaptation to a Hellenized world. A most interesting attempt at reinterpretation began in the 11th century, leading to the schism in the 16th century. The Renaissance was no more than let me read that again. The Renaissance was no more a rejuvenation of antiquity than Protestantism was a return to the primitive Christianity. It was a new interpretation necessitated by the devitalization of the Catholic Church. Today, Christianity is devitalized by its remoteness from the spirit of the times. It stands in It stands in need of a new union with or relation to the atomic age, which is a unique novelty in history. The myth needs to be retold in a new spiritual language, for the new wine can no more be poured into the old bottles that it could in the Hellenistic age. Even conservative Jewry had to produce an entirely new version of the myth in its Kabbalistic gnosis. It is my practical experience that psychological understanding immediately revivifies the essential Christian ideas and fills them with the breath of life. This is because our worldly light, i.e., scientific knowledge and understanding, coincides with the symbolic statements of the myth, whereas previously we were unable to bridge the gulf between knowing and believing. Coming back to your letter, pages 2 through 3 of September 25th, I must say that I could accept your definition of the summum bonum. Whatever God is, that is good, if it did not interfere with or twist our sense of good. In dealing with the moral nature of an act of God, we have either to suspend our moral judgment and blindly follow the dictates of this superior will, or we have to judge in a human fashion and call white white and black black. In spite of the fact that we sometimes obey this superior will blindly and almost heroically, I do not think that this is the usual thing, nor is it commendable on the whole to act blindly, because we are surely expected to act with conscious moral reflection. It is too dangerously easy to avoid responsibility by deluding ourselves that our will is the will of God. We can forcibly overcome by the latter. We can be forcibly overcome by the latter, but if we are not, we must use our judgment, and then we are faced with the inexorable fact that, humanly speaking, some acts of God are good and some bad, so much so that the assumption of a summum bonum becomes almost an act of hubris. If God can be understood as the perfect complexio oppositorum, so can Christ. I can agree with your view about Christ completely, only it is not the tradition, only it is not the traditional, but a very modern conception which is on the way to the desired interpretation. I also agree with your understanding of Tao and its contrast to Christ, who is indeed the paradigm of the reconciliation of the divine opposites in man brought about in the process of individuation. Thus Christ stands for the treasure and the supreme good. In German, good equals gut, but the noun gut also means property and treasure. When theology makes metaphysical assertions, the conscience of the scientist cannot back it up. Since Christ never meant more to me than what I could understand of him, and since this understanding coincides with my empirical knowledge of the self, I have to admit that I mean the self in dealing with the idea of Christ. As a matter of fact, I have no other access to Christ but the self, and since I do not know anything beyond the self, I cling to this archetype. I say, here is the living and perceptible archetype which has been projected upon the man Jesus, or has historically manifested itself in him. If this collective archetype had not been associated with Jesus, we would have remained he would have remained a nameless Zadok. I actually prefer the term self because I am talking to Hindus as well as to Christians, and I do not want to divide but to unite. Since I am putting my cards on the table, I must confess that I cannot detach a certain feeling of dishonesty from any metaphysical assertion. One may speculate, but not assert. One cannot reach beyond oneself, and if somebody assures you he can reach beyond himself and his natural limitations, he overreaches himself and becomes immodest and untrue. This was Dr. Jung's criticism of Martin Buber, who did make such assertions. This may be a deformation professionnelle, the prejudice of a scientific conscience. Let me just read this in a translated kind of way. This may be the prejudice of a scientific conscience. Science is an honest-to-God attempt to get at the truth, and its rule is never to assert more than one can prove within reasonable and defensible limits. This is my attitude in approaching the problem of religious experience. I am unable to envisage anything beyond the self, since it is, by definition, a borderline concept designating the unknown totality of man. There are no known limits to the unconscious. There is no reason whatsoever why you should or should not call the beyond self Christ, or Buddha, or Purusha, or Tao, or Kidder, or Tefrith. All these terms are recognizable formulations of what I call the self. Moreover, I dislike the insistence upon a special name, since my human brethren are as good and as valid as I am. Why should their name-giving be less valid than mine? It is not easy for a layman to get the desired theological information, because even the Church is not at one with herself in this respect. Who represents authentic Christianity? Thus the layman, whether he likes it or not, has to quote Protestant or Catholic statements pell-mell as Christian views because they are backed up by some authority. In my case, I believe I have been careful in quoting my sources. You, as a theologian, are naturally interested in the best possible view or explanation, while the psychologist is interested in all sorts of opinions because he wants to acquire some understanding of mental phenomenology and cares little for even the best possible metaphysical assertion, which is beyond human reach anyhow. The various creeds are just so many phenomena to him, and he has no means of deciding about the truth or the ultimate validity of any metaphysical statement. I cannot select the best or the ultimate opinions because I do not know which kind of opinion to choose from. From which church. Also, I do not care particularly where such opinions come from, and it is quite beyond my capacity to find out whether they are erroneous or not. I would be wrong only if I attributed, for instance, the idea of conceptio immaculata to Protestantism, or the sola fide standpoint to Catholicism. I guess conceptio immaculata must mean the virgin birth, and the sola fide, I'm not sure what that would be, but let's look it up. faith alone. Sola fide is faith alone. So, so if I read this without the Latin, I would be wrong only if I attributed, for instance, the idea of the Immaculate Conception to Protestantism, or the idea of faith alone standpoint to Catholicism. The many misunderstandings attributed to me come into this category. In either case, it is plain to see that someone has been careless in his assumptions. But if I attribute Ritschl's Christological views to Protestantism, it is no error, in spite of the fact that the Church of England does not subscribe to the opinion. It is no error, in spite of the fact that the Church of England It is no error, in spite of the fact that the Church of England does not subscribe to the opinions of Mr. Ritschl or of Mr. Barth. I hope I have not inadvertently been guilty of some misquotation. I can illustrate the problem by a typical instance. My little essay on Eastern meditation deals with the popular tract Amita Dhyana Sutra. Deals with the popular tract Amita Dhyana Sutra, which is a relatively late and not very valuable Mahayana text. A critic objected to my choice. He could not see why I should take such an inconspicuous tract instead of a genuinely Buddhist and classical Pali text in order to present Buddhist thought. He entirely overlooked the fact that I had no intention whatever of expounding classical Buddhism, but that my aim was to analyze the psychology of this particular text. Why should I not deal with Jacob Boehme or Angelus Silesius as Christian writers, even though they are not classical representatives either of Catholicism or Protestantism? A similar misunderstanding appears in your view that I am not doing justice to the ideal of community. Whenever possible, I avoid ideals and much prefer realities. I have never found a community which would allow full expression to the individual within it. Suppose the individual is going to speak the truth, regardless of the feelings of everybody else. He would not only be the most abominable enfant terrible, but might equally well cause a major catastrophe. Edifying examples of this can be observed at the meetings of Buckman's so-called Oxford Group movement. At the expense of truth, the individual has to behave, i.e., suppress his reaction merely for the sake of Christian charity. What if I should get up after a sermon about ideals and ask the parson how much he himself is able to live up to his admonitions? In my own case, the mere fact that I am seriously interested in psychology has created a peculiar hostility or fear in certain circles. What has happened to those people in the church, that is, in a Christian community, who ventured to have a new idea? No community can escape the laws of mass psychology. I am critical of the community in the same way as I suspect the individual who builds his castles in Spain while anxiously avoiding the expression of his own convictions. I am shy of ideals which one preaches and never lives up to, simply because one cannot. I want to know rather what we can live. I want to build up a possible human life which carries through God's experiment and does not invent an ideal scheme, knowing that it will never be fulfilled. Okay, that is the first of the two letters. The second one is only 4 pages, but unfortunately, I think I am running short on time. Maybe I can do it. But what I want to do is change recording. So I'm going to stop my recording, but continue to stream. And then I'll start the recording again because I don't want to get my recording too darn long. Okay, let's look. All right, so I have no further comments from my listeners, and I still have listeners. So I guess I don't have listeners, however, on I'm going to stop my Periscope broadcast because I don't have anybody still there. I've had 63 viewers on Periscope, though. That's cool. Okay. So apparently the Reverend David Cox sent a reply to this long letter from Dr. Jung. And so Dr. Jung sent a second letter. And so it's to Reverend David Cox, a later letter. It's dated 12 November 1957. I am much obliged to you for telling me exactly what you think and for criticizing my blunt ways of thinking and writing, also of talking, I am afraid. Right. It seems, however, to be the style of natural scientists. We simply state our proposition, assuming that nobody will think it to be more than a disputable hypothesis. We are so imbued with doubts concerning our assumptions that skepticism is taken for granted. We are therefore apt to omit the conventional here's another Latin term. I will give it to you in a moment here. Captatio benevolentiae lectoris. Okay. So here's the Latin. And here's the English, which is the earning the goodwill of the reader. Okay. So, we are therefore apt to omit the conventional captatio benevolentiae lectoris with hesitation I submit, or I consider it a daring hypothesis, etc. We even forget the preamble. This is the way I look at it. The case of the Jesuit was that he put the direct question to me: how on earth can you suggest that Christ was not human? The discussion was naturally on the dogmatic level, as there is no other basis on which this question can be answered. It is not a question of truth, because the problem itself is far beyond human judgment. My answer to Job is merely a reconstruction of the psychology discernible in this and other Old Testament texts for the interested layman. He knows very little of the higher criticism, which is historical and philological in the main, and it is but little concerned with the layman's reactions to the paradoxes and moral horrors of the Old Testament. He knows his Bible and hears the sermons of his parson or priest. As a Catholic, he has had a dogmatic education. When talking of Job, you must always remember that I am dealing with the psychology of an archetypal and anthropomorphic image of God, and not with a metaphysical entity. As far as we can see, the archetype is a psychic structure with a life of its own to a certain extent. God in the Old Testament is a guardian of law and morality, yet is himself unjust. He is a moral paradox, unreflecting in an ethical sense. We can perceive God in an infinite variety of images, yet all of them are anthropomorphic. Otherwise, they would not get into our heads. The divine paradox is the source of unending suffering to man. Job cannot avoid seeing it, and thus he sees more than God himself. This explains why the God image has to come down into the flesh. The paradox, expressed, of course, with many hesitations in the particularities of the myth and in the Catholic dogma, is clearly discernible in the fact that the suffering righteous man is, historically speaking, an erroneous conception, not identical with the suffering God, because he is Jesus Christ, worshipped as a separate God. He is a mere prefiguration painfully included in a trinity, and not an ordinary man who is forced to accept the suffering of intolerable opposites he has not invented. They were preordained. He is the victim because he is capable of three-dimensional consciousness and ethical decision. This is a bit condensed. Unlike Yahweh, man has self-reflection. I don't know what Job is supposed to have seen, but it seems possible that he unconsciously anticipated the historical future, namely the evolution of the God image. God had to become man. Man's suffering does not derive from his sins, but from the maker of his imperfections, the paradoxical God. The righteous man is the instrument into which God enters in order to attain self-reflection and thus consciousness and rebirth as a divine child trusted to the care of adult man. Now, this is not the statement of a truth, but the psychological reading of a mythological text, a model constructed for the purpose of establishing the psychological linking together of its contents. My aim is to show what the results are when you apply modern psychology to such a text. Higher criticism and Hebrew philology are obviously superfluous because it is simply a question of the text which the layman has under his eyes. The Christian religion has not been shaped by higher criticism. The trouble I have with my academic reader is that he cannot see a psychic structure as a relatively autonomous entity, because he is under the illusion that he is dealing with a concept, but in reality it is a living thing. The archetype all have a life of their own, which allows a biological pattern. A church that has evolved a masculine trinity will follow the old pattern, 3+1, where 1 is a female, and if 3 equals good, 1 is a woman, will mediate between good and evil, the latter being the devil and the shadow of the Trinity. The woman will inevitably be the mother-sister of the sun god, with whom she will be united in thalamus, i.e., in the hieros gamos, quod est demonstratum, by the second encyclical concerning the Assumption. Again, he's referring to the Papal Bull of 1950. A passionate discourse between the man Job and God will logically lead to a mutual rapprochement. God will be humanized, man will be divinized. Thus, Job will be followed by the idea of the incarnation of God and the redemption and apotheosis of man. The development, however, is seriously impeded by the fact that the woman is always inevitably seriously impeded by the fact that the woman, as always, inevitably brings in the problem of the shadow. Therefore, another Latin term here, so I better translate this. Okay. So here's the term, and here's the translation. To any women who are watching this, I have to apologize. This is... Anyway, this is what Dr. Jung said, and he's actually referring to what the church says, I guess. Therefore, mulier taciat in ecclesia, the arch sin of Catholic Church is ever... The arch sin of the Catholic Church is ever after is sexuality, and the ideal par excellence, virginity. The ideal par excellence, virginity, which puts a definite stop to life. But if life should insist on going on, the shadow steps in and sin becomes a serious problem, because the shadow cannot be left to eternal damnation anymore. Consequently, at the end of the first millennium of the Christian eon, as predicted in the Apocalypse, the world was suspected of being created by the devil. The impressive and still living myth of the Holy Grail came to life with its two significant figures of Parsifal and Merlin. At the same time, we observe an extraordinary development of alchemical philosophy with its central figure of the Filius Macrocosmi, a chthonic equivalent of Christ. This was followed by the great and seemingly incurable schism of the Christian Church, and last but not least by the still greater and more formidable schism of the world towards the end of the second millennium. The psychological reading of the dominant archetypal images reveals a continuous series of psychological transformations depicting the autonomous life of archetypes behind the scenes of consciousness. This hypothesis has been worked out to clarify and make comprehensible. This hypothesis has been worked out to clarify and make comprehensible our religious history, the treatment of psychological troubles, and the inability of my patients to understand theological interpretations and terminology have given me my motive. The necessities of psychotherapy have proved to me the immense importance of a religious attitude, which cannot be achieved without a thorough understanding of religious tradition, just as an individual's troubles cannot be understood and cured without a basic knowledge of their biographical without a basic knowledge of their biographical antecedents. I have applied to the God image what I have learned from the reconstruction of so many human lives through a knowledge of their unconscious. All this is empirical and may have nothing to do with theology, if theology says so. But if theology could come to the conclusion that its tenets have something to do with the empirical human psyche, I establish a claim. I think that in those circumstances my opinion should be given a hearing. It cannot be argued on the level of metaphysical assertions. It can be criticized only on its own psychological level, regardless of whether it is psychologically satisfactory interpretations of the facts or not. The facts are the documented historical manifestations of the archetype, however erroneous they may be. I have stated my point of view bluntly, for which I must ask your forgiveness. In order to give you a fair chance to see it as clearly as possible. In order to give you a fair chance to see it as clearly as possible. The end of your letter, where you deal with Christ, leaves me with a doubt. It looks to me as if you were trying to explain the empirical man Jesus, while I am envisaging the archetype of the anthropos and its very general interpretation as a collective phenomenon, and not as the best possible interpretation of an individual and historical person. Christianity as a whole is less concerned with the historical man Jesus and his somewhat doubtful biography than with the mythological anthropos, or godson figure. It would be rather hazardous to attempt to analyze the historical Jesus as a human person. Christ appears for a much safer because mythological background. Christ appears from a much safer because mythological background, which invites psychological elucidation. Moreover, it is not the Jewish rabbi and reformer Jesus, but the archetypal Christ who touches upon the archetype of the Redeemer in everybody and carries conviction. My approach is certainly not theological and cannot be treated as a theologomenon. It is essentially a psychological attempt based on the archetypal, amoral God image, which is not a concept but rather an irrational, phenomenal experience, an Urbild. But insofar as theologians are also concerned with the adult human psyche, perhaps not as much as medical psychology, I am convinced that it would be of advantage to them to become more acquainted with the psychological aspects of the Christian religion. I will not conceal the fact that theological thinking is very difficult for me, from which I conclude that psychological thinking must be an equally laborious undertaking for a theologian. This may explain why I inundate you with such a long letter. When I see how China, and soon India, will lose her old culture under the impact of materialistic rationalism, I grow afraid that the Christian West will succumb to the same malady, simply because the old symbolic language is no longer understood and people cannot see anymore where and how it applies. In Catholic countries, anyone leaving the church becomes frankly atheistic. In Protestant countries, a small number become sectarians, and the others avoid the churches for their cruelly boring and empty sermons. Not Yeah, this is a man who never went to church after his wedding, so sorry for my... I better reread this sentence so that you can appreciate the following sentence. In Protestant countries, a small number become sectarians, and the others avoid the churches for their cruelly boring and empty sermons. Not a few begin to believe in the state, not even knowing that they themselves are the state. The recent broadcasts of the BBC give a good picture of the educated layman's mind with regard to religion. What an understanding! All due to the lack of a psychological understanding. No. What an understanding. All due to the lack of a psychological standpoint, or so it seems to me. I am sorry that I am apparently a Petra Scandali. A Petra Scandali is a stumbling block. So I am sorry that I am apparently a Petra Scandali. I do not mean to offend. Please accept my apologies for my bluntness. I am sincerely grateful to you for giving me your attention. Faithfully yours, C.G. Jung. So, there you have it. Are there any thoughts or questions that you might have? I have, let's see, I think I have about 18 minutes left on this on this live stream. So if you have questions or comments, for those who joined late, I have been reading from, let's see, how do I show this? For those who came late, I've been reading from The New God Image by Edward Edinger. And its subtitle is A Study of Jung's Key Letters Concerning the Evolution of the Western God Image by Edward F. Edinger. So, Dr. Jung was rather blunt, but he certainly said a lot of things that a lot of us know about the church. What I can say is that I was raised in a Protestant church, in the Presbyterian church primarily, and also in military chapels, which are non-denominational. So that creed tradition is like the Reformed Church, which is where Dr. Jung was raised. His father was a Reformed minister who had lost his faith, and that was one of the reasons for Dr. Jung's lifelong effort to understand Christianity from a psychological basis. In my case, I used to go to church regularly. I was a deacon of a Reformed church at one point. And I noted that when I went to church, it made me feel better. I didn't know why. And the pastor couldn't say anything to me about what God was. I asked him, what is God? God's not up there, so where's God and what is God? And that pastor had no answer for me. And so after that, pretty much, I pulled out of the church. I did, when we went to Japan, I went to the Tokyo Union Church, which again was something like a military church. And so non-denominational Protestant. And when I first went to Japan, the Cathedral of Yokohama was still rubble. in Yokohama when I was 15 years old, and just 17 years after World War II. But anyway, there are many strong Christians, especially Catholics, in Japan today. But for me, I found that when I started to study Buddhism, which mostly I regard as not a religion but a philosophy, because there's no God, there's no saints, there's no sinners, there's no right, no wrong. There are 84,000 teachings of the Buddha. But when I started to read on Buddhism, it made me a better Christian. And when I started to study Dr. Jung, it made me a better Christian and a better Buddhist. And so, for what it's worth, I still follow all three in some way. And but I think that Dr. Jung has pretty much summarized my views. I mean, obviously, I'm very attracted to his work, and I wouldn't be doing this YouTube channel if I wasn't. So let's see. Matthew says, all I have to say is Jung hits the nail on the head so hard it gives me goosebumps. Yeah. You think? No wonder the theologians couldn't cope with him. Because where do you start? if you've been brought up as a pastor or a priest, where do you start dealing with what Dr. Jung said? And I've been very fascinated, obviously, by the recent work of Dr. Jordan Peterson, who wrote a book which seems to be very good called The Maps of Meaning. And he's informed by Dr. Jung's work. And so I don't love everything about Jordan Peterson, but I'm not technically a psychologist. He is, and so I make no claims there. I only have studied Dr. Jung's work for a long time. I think it's fascinating to find that there's this pastor in Sacramento whose name is Paul Vanderklay, who also has a channel here on YouTube. And at the beginning, he started to comment on Jordan Peterson. And at the beginning, he almost couldn't figure out what to make of Jordan Peterson. And I've started to communicate with him and help him to see where Dr. Peterson is coming from. And, it's obvious that something's got to give and that we need to change our ways, because this duality that Dr. Jung talked about is, we no longer have the duality between the USA and USSR, but we do have the red state, blue state duality in our country. And we are not going to have wholeness in our country until we can not cure that neurosis, because neuroses are rarely cured, but at least we can mature beyond it. In some of Dr. Jung's writings where he talks about neurosis, he says that neuroses are normally not cured. They are rather circumscribed and put off in a corner of the psyche, and the patient matures beyond the neurosis. And so when we talk about our nation, we surely have to find ways to see our country as one whole thing. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more on Monday evening in the regular reading group session. And as I've told a number of you, my local group, which was very important for me when I first got started because I needed some grounding on what I was doing with Carl Jung, they have graciously agreed to discontinue our local meetings and to do our local meetings online. So beginning this coming Monday evening at 8 p.m., we will be doing all of our meetings online. We did it a little bit during my recuperation from my ankle replacement, so some of you may have been participated at that time. But in any case, on Monday evening, I intend to address individuation and to talk about various aspects of that as it relates to all these things, including the political aspects. So Marie says, I am Catholic, but I explored other faiths because I'm seeking for something. I got interested in psychology, alchemy, esoteric, and Jung's work is all about my interests. I think that that's very appropriate for you, Marie. And I think it's interesting to see some of the things that you've been putting on your channel, which are definitely about alchemy. So, one of the things that I haven't gotten too much into, if I run out of the key writings related to religion of Dr. Jung's, I may go back and start reading his alchemical books. I have read them in the past, and for example, the book called Psychology and Alchemy is really a history of Western thought, and it's really a history of the evolution of consciousness as such. And it's interesting that Dr. Erich Neumann, who was a very close, he was referred to as Jung's rationalist. But anyway, Dr. Neumann, during World War II, he was Jewish, and he escaped Europe and went to Israel and lived in Tel Aviv for the rest of his life after 1934. And between 1940 and 1945, he was entirely cut off from the Jungian group. There were no letters, no communication whatsoever. And during that time, Dr. Neumann wrote The Origins and History of Consciousness, which was an 800-page manuscript when it was presented to Dr. Jung for assistance with publication. And the Jung Institute, which was the close disciples of Dr. Jung, was afraid to publish it because they were afraid it would kind of overwhelm what they were trying to do with the Jung Institute. So they did not publish it, but Dr. Jung arranged for it to be published by a Zurich publisher, and it was ultimately published. But her book is very good, and also Erich Neumann's book is very good. Also, he wrote about child psychology, and he also wrote a book called The Great Mother, also during the war. So he's worth reading because he was a first-generation disciple of Dr. Jung, just as Esther Harding was. Now, Dr. Edinger, whose book I'm reading, is actually a third generation, or second generation, because there was Esther Harding, and she influenced Edward Edinger. And so now I'm in the third generation of people because I'm bringing forth their ideas. They've all died, and so I'm keeping them alive to the extent that I can. Any other comments or thoughts before I call an end to this live stream, because we have less than 5 minutes left, or YouTube is going to crash us anyway. So anyway, thank you for many of you sticking with me on this. That was a difficult reading. I had a mental block about reading that letter, partially because the two letters are so long, and maybe partially because I didn't know how it would come out. And I still have to now take these videos and edit them so that they're properly presented. But I felt it was important to get these ideas out into the collective unconscious, which is my objective in creating these videos in the first place. And so I thank you all for attending, and I will see you on Monday night, perhaps. I'll begin at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So talk to you then. Bye.